we have Lonnie Weinheimer of Adelphi, who is going to do a story entitled Going Home.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Close and still, you want to speak up a little.
Yep. Last year, my employer invited
That's good.
all of us to write to our colleagues because we didn't know anything about each other's lives outside of work. And so I wrote this. And I'm happy to be sharing with you tonight. I grew up on a tree farm in upstate New York. It sounds idyllic to think about it now. I was the fourth daughter of a family of 7 children. My father was a self-employed consulting forester, and my mother taught piano lessons, a church organist, choir leader, in a small rural church, as well as Girl Scout leader. My family members were and still are gardeners, composters, recyclers. As a teenager, my escape was roaming the woods in my free time. I was quite proud of my ability to walk in any direction in the woods, cutting through for a mile or so to surrounding homes on other roads, and find my way back again without necessarily using any of the roads. For a while as a teenager, my plan for my future was to build a log cabin in the woods and live off the land. Not completely worked out in detail, but I knew others had done it, and I was pretty good at woodworking, sewing, cleaning fish, and could skin a rabbit, woodchuck, or deer. I had a lot of other interests too, though. Going to college was one of them. So no surprise that I soon moved away and pursued interests in biology, healthcare, medicine, acupuncture, and eventually marrying and starting a family. It was important for me that my children knew where I grew up. Luckily, my mother lived a good long life, insisting on remaining in the rambling old farmhouse where she raised us. My kids associate her house with the holidays and vacations that we spent there with their grandmother, aunts, uncles, and cousins. When her taxes increased and she decided to sell a few acres to raise the money to pay them, I bought 7 acres of my father's old Christmas tree plantations. These were the 3 fields where I used to pick blueberries with my family on 4th of July, work with my family my father planting trees when I was a preschooler, shaping the trees with a machete as a teenager, and after Thanksgivings, selling them to neighbors and acquaintances who came out in all kinds of weather to pick out, cut, and drag out of the field their Christmas tree the old-fashioned way. When my mother passed, her home and woodland were sold. My children are off to college and beyond, but we still meet for holidays in the area where 3 of my siblings live, though no one house is able to accommodate all the relatives as my mother's used to. We have permission to hike on the family property since it sold and made friends with the people who did a great job fixing up my parents' old home. My family members have asked me what I was planning to do with the property I bought from my mother, but I had no plan except perhaps to sell it if I needed money to put my children through college until about 2 years ago. My daughter created her major in college, anthropological environmental aspects of architecture. She was fascinated with alternative building, especially cob houses, since middle school, and spent one summer working on a straw bale house. She introduced me to a company that produces wooden yurt-type buildings in kits to be assembled by families or friends. They have multiple 4-foot-wide panels around a central skylight, reminiscent of the circular tents used by nomads of Central Asia. For 5 to 6 years, the site has been a visible tab at the top side of my computer, although I never intended to put it there. I don't know how that happened, and intentionally had no intention to make use of it. The year before last, I took a week off in May and spent time at my brother's home, 20-minute drive from the property I grew up on. I spent several days digging 10-inch wide, 30-inch deep percolation test holes in the first field of my property, which is now a stand of 50-plus-year-old evergreen trees. The idea was to see how well the percolation test holes drained. They didn't. They filled up with water as they were being dug and are still well springs of water. In July, I spent another week digging similar holes in the far side of the second field. This was more promising as the holes were dry when I dug them, even though they were filled with water by the time I came to check on them the next day. It had been a very wet year. Finally, I moved farther to the third field. Kind of like with the little pigs. The third field is a stand of 60-plus-year-old straight, tall, red pine trees that my father and eldest sister planted before I was born. The percolation test holes there were on land that sloped the opposite direction of the other fields, and they were dry and stayed dry as they were supposed to allow the building of a septic field. The tall, straight trees left an open view to the west, and I realized this was a beautiful place to build, despite the woods road winding over 700 feet from the dirt road. Through the fall and winter, I drove to the site 1 or 2 weekends a month to cut young trees from the old woods road, which is partially overgrown. Also from the building site, from the path through the woods where the new electric line would have to be buried, and a place for a solar collector. The south side of the second field grew very few trees because of the wet ground, but made a good opening for solar panels to be installed. I worked alongside my brother who cut larger trees, which we sawed into movable lengths and moved to piles to be used later for firewood or lumber. I also met with excavators, septic engineers, electricians, solar and geothermal installers, and made visits in the nearby town hall to learn from the building inspectors how to apply for a building permit. I spent hours in the evening speaking with the yurt designing company on the West Coast and finally signed a contract working on a design for the building. Until the end of May, it was still too wet to start any parts of the project, either the driveway, septic, solar, or electric conduit ditch. Then things started happening too fast to keep track of. All the excavations were set to be done one after the other, 5 weeks before the yurt kit will be delivered and my family will arrive for a reunion and start to put it together. My sister-in-law suggested having the family reunion on the building week, and I'm thrilled at the idea. By that time, the basement needs to be poured, the flooring placed, to build the frame of the yurt on it. With anticipation similar to perching on a bike the first time, trying to time the pedaling with the steering, I keep moving forward, just praying I don't crash or topple over. There have been times where I couldn't figure what made me think I could take on such a project. It is at times exhilarating and many times profoundly peaceful. I've worked on it in each season the previous year, watching or listening to birds, the nearly constant companions, shaggy May mushrooms, soggy in September rain, the first snow in October, wild turkeys on Christmas morning, the Christmas tree plantation decorated with snow and ice in January, wild windstorms in February, swelling buds in March, the last melting snow in April, along with spring peepers, and in June, tree frogs, ferns, maturing pine cones and flowers, chipmunks, and always the birds. All of these, especially my family and neighbors dropping by, touched my heart with the knowing that this is the right project for me to